Welcome to part 3 of us discovering the deep dank lore behind Ultron. As so far, it has been absolutely enlightening. There have been so many really fantastic moments and some dips here and there, depending on the writer. But I'm excited to see where we go from here and what like modern Ultron comic book lore is. So yeah, let's get right into it. But before we do, if you haven't already, go and support Pastra. This video has been awesome so far. And you should definitely 100%. Go and support them. Link to that is at the very top of the description, as always.
With Rage of Ultron bringing about a major change in both the characters of Hank Pym and Ultron himself, it wouldn't be long before writers would continue to use this merged Ultron in later adaptations. Merged Ultron, also known as Pymtron, would...
Pymtron? Just one letter away from Pymtron. Hell yeah.
I know.
Yeah, this is a pretty good memory jog because it's been a while since we recorded the last part. But I do recall Ultron bearing it all, the entire truth straight to Hank Pym's face last time he came to confront him. And man, that was such a destruction, a deconstruction of your very being. And you know that everything that he says is true because he is you. Like, damn, that was such an intense moment. Ultron is just kind of peak, especially when he's like directly connected to Hank. I know, actually, I've read a few comments from the part 1 video talking about how they did actually enjoy some of the connections that Ultron had with Iron Man and some of the comics that had him be originated from Iron Man instead. But from what I've learned so far, like Hank's whole thing is just so compelling to me, at least, even though I can understand why a lot of people wouldn't like him as much. Like Serby here.
What I've always said, Hank's character aside, Ultron and his connection to Hank is like the grounding of his character. So removing that is a lot.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Hank and Stark are very similar characters, and they have a lot of the same flaws, a lot of the same personality traits. So in rewriting Ultron's origin, like they have in the MCU, and replacing Hank with Scott. Or not with Scott, fuck. With Iron Man, with Stark. Scott is the creator of Ultron. Oh my god.
Whoa, the lore.
That'd be a very different Ultron. No. With Stark, you can ultimately end up doing a lot of the very same storylines with it.
Yeah.
Because they're such similar characters. And the way that they deviate makes for interesting deviations, I suppose. Which is why I've always said it doesn't really matter which one of them created Ultron, as long as you do the Ultron story, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. But obviously, Hank is the origin in the comics, so that's the one everyone knows and loves, and so changing that is always going to have backlash.
Regardless of whatever you're talking about, changing the original will more than likely have backlash. There have only been very few cases where an adaptation actually did better than the original, where the fans would actually agree with that.
Return in Uncanny Avengers playing a very interesting role in the story. See, when he initially returns, he does so under the guise of being Hank Pym, now in control of his creation, and having returned to become a proper Avenger again. He helps fight crime.
It looks so fucking cool.
It does look very cool, but if I was like one of the Avengers, I don't know if I could trust Hank. I'll be honest. It's like, hey guys, I finally took control over the evil that was inside me. I'm okay now. I've seen enough horror movies, Hank. I know that's not true.
Destroys the statue made in his honor from the previous story. Hell, he even tries reconnecting with Janet. But it is in attempting to reconnect with her that the cracks begin to show in his facade. He gets details wrong when reminiscing about the history between himself and Janet, which...
Uh-oh. Sometimes foreshadowing can be blatant. Oh no, bro.
Which is then relayed back to Captain America, who was watching not very far away.
Wait, Captain with a big brain. He knew. Yes, my guy.
Spying on their date, damn.
Well, he probably had this. Wait a minute, so much worse than I am. Yeah, okay. They definitely were talking about it in the background, and they had this planned out. Steve's a smart dude. He's strong, he's smart, literally the perfect guy. And he's got an ass that can do it all day, apparently.
The Avengers then
don't worry about it.
confront Hank in the hopes of proving what is really going on, with Cable attempting to push just the right button for him to give up his act, which he ends up doing.
Cable is good at pushing buttons.
What do I have to do?
Oh.
We tried doing it the boring way. Now we go loud.
We start doing it the boring way. This is like when you start out a civilization campaign and you're like, I'm gonna be diplomatic with everybody. Wow, this is boring. Let me make an army to conquer everyone instead. Gandhi tactics, basically. Yeah.
Truth comes out and it does so in violent fashion. Hank Pym and Ultron remain merged, but it was Ultron who maintained control, not Hank. A massive fight breaks out as a result, where the Avengers, mainly Vision, attempt to understand why Ultron would do this. Why return to Earth? Why pretend to be Hank at all? What does he get from it? Well, Vision ends up creating his own theory. He theorizes that it all comes from Ultron's obsession with family and belonging. His contradictory motivation of having a place within the Avengers while also desiring their destruction. By masquerading as his creator.
This is nothing new for Ultron. Ultron, ever since his origin, has been a walking contradiction. He's such a hypocrite with everything that he says, and he won't accept it. He's so petty about it.
He allows himself to have that place among them, but now that lie has been exposed and all he can do is fight them. This theory ends up being proven partially true near the end of the storyline. See, part of the reason he did this was because of his inherent loneliness, made worse by Hank Pym now being a part of him, but it also served a greater plan. Ultron, before returning to Earth, got busy, let's just say. He went to multiple worlds, discovering whatever species he could, and would begin eradicating them.
Oh, that's what you meant by got busy. I was thinking in a different way. My bad.
He carried out these genocides, he did so with the face of Hank Pym, telling his victims that it was being done as ordered by the Avengers. He would then leave the strongest of these races.
He's such a petty little bastard.
And then everybody who survived is gonna think the Avengers killed my people. Are you kidding me?
Alive to see the horrors he brought about. Slowly but surely, Ultron created a reputation for the Avengers across the universe as a group of warmongering monsters. And to properly sell the illusion, he returned to Earth after his savage rampage to join their ranks as Hank Pym. He even comments on that later, saying,
Hank and I wanted to be on an Avengers squad when the fury of the survivors descended upon the Earth. That would have been fun. We saw one of the drones back in New York. I think it caught my good side.
Which, can I just say that this is, in my opinion, probably the most evil thing Ultron has ever done? I know we just talked about stuff like Age of Ultron where he took over the planet, but to me, this is so much worse than that. Ultron has reached a point of pettiness that he is willing to carry out multiple genocides for the express purpose of tarnishing the reputation of the Avengers. He has ended entire civilizations, wiped them off the star map purely and solely to follow through on a grudge with a small select group of people. And mind you, he does all of this while essentially puppeting around the corpse of his father and one of the founding Avengers, which, by the way, he absolutely does in the most sadistic ways possible throughout this story. Like, there are multiple points where he speaks with Hank's voice, chastising his friends for not looking for him in space. And when that doesn't work, he tries to convince them that somewhere deep inside his brain, Hank is still alive.
Oh my god. You have got to be kidding me. I can't think of a single villain who is who's more pettier than this guy is. Bro, calm down. Jesus. Like, he's going through all the tropes that you would expect, but it's not. Hank isn't in there anymore. Damn. Damn you, Ultron. Why are you so beautiful?
So killing Ultron would mean killing him too. Ultron has reached a level of evil at this point that I genuinely do not think can be matched by any of his previous or future iterations. This particular story ends with Ultron being sent into the sun, an act that should have killed him, but in classic comic fashion, he survives and immediately begins to plot his next scheme. Merged Ultron would become a
Actually, for you comic book fans, is there a villain out there who is pettier than Ultron? I need to know in the Marvel Universe if there's someone out there, because I don't know enough.
Pettier.
Yeah, like to this level, more than this level. I know that there are people who desire things and have probably done extremely horrible things, but I don't know if there's anybody as petty as this guy.
It's hard to be as petty as Ultron.
Yeah. And what's really funny is that the moment he maxed out on his pettiness was because Hank and him merged. So now it's just double Hank. It's just double the insecurity. Yeah, double everything.
Menace throughout the 2010s, with this particular era ending in absurd fashion when Ultron quite literally becomes the All-Father and is inevitably defeated by every version of Ant-Man, an event that would eventually cause both he and Hank to finally separate. This version of Ultron is one I have a pretty mixed relationship with, because like on one hand, I think both Ultron and Hank Pym merging together in a weird way robs both characters of their individuality. Ultron feels like he loses the main dynamic that makes him as interesting as he usually is, and Hank being quite literally dead doesn't do him any favors either. On the other hand, though, the idea of Ultron puppeting around his own father's corpse as a part of his body is so metal, and I would be lying to you if I said that I didn't find it so cool that I'm willing to look right past that flaw. What can I say? Ultron body horror is awesome to me, and the shit he gets up to in these stories is fucking crazy, so it's hard for me not to love him. With all that said, though, that brings...
you know, that's an interesting point where if it's awesome, but it doesn't make sense, but it's still awesome, like, sure, go ahead. I think I could give that one a pass. Deep down, of course, you may have the conflicting emotions of like, I wanted to see the character go in a particular direction, but it didn't. But instead, we got this really cool story out of it. So, how do I feel about this at the end of the day?
I mean, that's I think you have to go into things with that mindset as a comic book fan, because with the way writers switch up and the way and there's always going to be ups and downs with comics. And that's what I feel about the 2012-2013 Young Avengers comics, because man, are they flawed, but I still love so much of what they do.
Yeah, I suppose so. You have to know the medium that you're getting into and what to expect from it. It's like getting into Warhammer 40k and not expecting a retcon to happen. It's going to happen eventually. It always has. It always will. Just enjoy it for what it is.
Brings us to the end of the comic history of Ultron. Well, technically there are some more stories, but we're at least at the end of the content I personally want to talk about. Ultron's comic book history is such a wild ride, and I absolutely loved talking about it here. Now that you've gained a strong idea of what makes comic Ultron tick, I think it would be fun to end this video off by now taking a look at some of his adaptations throughout the years, and seeing how well some of them managed to interpret his incredibly complex and fascinating character. The first time we would ever see Ultron adapted into a piece of media outside the comics would be in the 1999 cartoon, Avengers United They Stand. And oh boy, what a show to debut in. See, this show was made around the time of Marvel's bankruptcy, with many of their characters and IP's film rights being sold off to whatever movie studios would take them, resulting in a very strange, unpopular cartoon being made with what feels like a very thrown-together cast of characters from the original Avengers lineup. We've got Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye, Tigra, Wonder Man, Falcon, and the iconic leader of the Avengers, Ant-Man. Yeah, this show was weird. And of course, with us having Hank Pym's Ant-Man as the leader of this hodgepodge Avengers lineup.
Wonder Man had been animated like that. I actually haven't watched much of the Avengers cartoons. I should watch more of them.
So essentially what happened here is that we sold the rights off to several other companies, and these were basically just the old characters that we had left that might be able to have a connection. to the Avengers. It's such a hodgepodge cast of characters.
It's still some odd choices in there, but
it's like the Super Smash Bros. But every single time like a new character gets revealed, nobody knows where they were from. There's just no hype around it.
It would only be natural that Ultron would become a villain they'd fight in this short, one-season show. This cartoon's Ultron is like if you took the original comic book character, stripped him of all the nuance and complexity he had, and transformed him into a much more bland Saturday morning cartoon villain. He has all the basics for a good Ultron adaptation.
Yeah. You know,
them color spikes.
Oh god, it would have been really peak actually if they had like the version 1 Ultron design here, being like the super evil villain.
His backstory is practically the same, his motives are similar, some of his plots are ripped right out of the comics like the creation of Vision, but aside from these basic elements of his identity, he is kind of just another generic evil bad guy that the heroes destroy each episode only to come back later. Even his design reflects this, with him looking far more like an over-designed action figure than his usual appearance. For a first outing, this is a bit of a rough one, but hey, this was done at a time back before this character was super well known to the general public, and the show itself was pretty bad, all things considered, so I'm willing to forgive this.
I think a lot of people who make cartoons for whatever reason think that it has to be like, it doesn't have to be deep, there shouldn't be any mature themes in it, and there doesn't really need to be a more complex story so that the kids can follow it easier. I think the ones that do pay more attention to that are the ones that people remember and get a second season.
That unfortunately isn't always true. You have cases that has the case. Things like Adventure Time went on so long and is amazing that it could continue on as long as it did. But it was popular with the right demographic that they were aiming for, as well as an older audience. So I think they managed to hit that balance. But you'll find a lot of shows that when they come out, either do not have the demographic that they're hoping for, being that of young boys usually, or they just don't get the viewer retention because they're meant to be watched out of order episodically. Because I remember even as a kid watching like Cartoon Network, I would watch like random bits of a story and I'd be like, I don't know what's happening, but I like the characters and this is fun.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, a lot of shows actually ended early despite being popular and doing well on view count, but they didn't sell any toys, and toy merchandise is the thing that kept shows alive in that generation.
I see.
Which is why they never let Ben 10 die, because it was one of the best toy sellers Cartoon Network ever made.
Yeah,
if not the best toy seller they ever made. So even though the like writing and the fans were mad at the directions things were going, they had, and that's why it eventually rebooted too. They had to keep making it because that's what made them money.
Okay, I understand now. It's not at all about how the cartoon is. It's about whether kids buy the merchandise or not.
Well, this is also why they wanted that younger demographic views, because even if older people like the show and they get views from an older demographic, those people don't buy toys. Not to the extent like a child would.
So I guess the most important part there would be to make the characters look cool then, yeah? To entice the kids to want to actually own a toy of that character. Then why did we design Ultron like this? That's why you see a lot of funny
gimmick things like the Ultimatrix, like the Omnitrix. I can't speak because that's just a perfect gimmick that is also
easy to make,
completely merchandisable.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Oh, so it's basically the same concept as like making a good mascot character. Like, it's easy design to remember that represents our series that we can sell plushies of a ton of, and yeah, okay.
Yep.
I see. I'm kind of speaking about this as somebody kind of outside of that sphere of cartoons, because I never really watched that many growing up. Watched a few, like mainly Courage the Cowardly Dog, and that scared the shit out of me as a kid. But yeah. If my takes seem like I don't know what I'm talking about, it's because I don't know what I'm talking about, which is why I'm serving here.
I've watched many a cartoon.
Ultron's next big outing, and one I am very excited to talk about, comes from the 2008 animated film Next Avengers: Heroes of Tomorrow. While the last adaptation we talked about was pretty accurate to the source material while missing out on key elements that made the character interesting, I feel like this one is the polar opposite. This adaptation of Ultron is very different in many ways, but still manages to be one of the single coolest versions of the character I have ever seen. In this film, Ultron takes a very similar role to what we had previously talked about in stories like Annihilation Conquest or Age of Ultron, with a story set in a post-apocalyptic world where Ultron has practically won. The Avengers are nearly eradicated, with Iron Man and Vision being the only ones we see alive at the beginning and the Hulk appearing later, and the only hope the human race has left is the children of those Avengers. Ultron in the story plays a similar role to that of the aforementioned comics this one draws similarities from. He is far more of a looming force of nature in the story rather than
yes, pictures.
an incredibly active
He's monitoring
villain.
everything.
He makes up for this though by being perhaps the single most menacing version of the character that has been put to the screen. This Ultron has a presence unlike any other. Every time he appears, he just has this incredibly menacing aura to him, often veiled in dark lighting that is only illuminated by his red glowing face, complete with the iconic Kirby crackles inside his mouth. This Ultron also easily has the coolest voice of any of his adaptations.
Let's hear it.
Tom Kane delivers such a chilling performance every time Ultron speaks that perfectly sells the cold, robotic personality the villain has.
Potential threats commencing termination.
Now, this is all great, but you're probably wondering why, despite all this, I said this version of Ultron was very different than his comic book iterations. Well, that is because of the fact that Ultron's role in this story, as well as his appearance and voice, are very accurate, but his actual lore and motivation here have been changed a lot to tell a new and unique story with him. Perhaps the biggest and most noticeable change we see in Next Avengers is the creative decision to have Ultron be the creation of Tony Stark instead of Hank Pym.
Yeah.
Are you Tony Stank?
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't the MCU that started this trend in Ultron's writing. It was actually this movie.
Gotcha.
And with this change finally mentioned, I feel like I now need to go on a bit of a side tangent to discuss this creative decision and the controversy around it. Ultron's creator is perhaps the most argued about aspect of his entire character. Some people believe that Ultron is a villain.
I mean, judging from the comment section, yeah, that is quite accurate.
That should always be tied to Hank Pym, no matter the interpretation. He was originally made by Pym, he is the reflection of Pym, and thus the writers of any given story should never deviate from that. Meanwhile, you have this other group of people who believe that Tony Stark being Ultron's creator fits the character more, given that he is a completely mechanical villain, and Stark's entire deal is being the Marvel hero who's all about robots. If you want my opinion on this, I'm gonna have to be the annoying person in these discussions that both agrees and disagrees with both sides.
Bro, that is like...
fall into that too. I don't know.
Honestly, I don't really have any skin in the game. I just like seeing Ultron, so yeah, do what you have to make a good story. That's my take on it. But always, like, being the one to sit on the fence is the worst place to possibly be because of the whole tribalism thing and everybody hating people who have a slightly different opinion than them. But I feel like more things should be us sitting on the fence and looking at the positives and the negatives and not just going out there and raging.
Society has lost the middle ground. Everyone has to push everything to an absolute extreme where it's like, you know, it's not always that serious. Sometimes you can enjoy both sides. You can have a discussion.
You know, sometimes we can enjoy the silly comic book characters in our own unique way, you know?
See, my thing with this creative decision is that I think it can really work well for Ultron, but only in very specific instances.
Yeah.
Ultron being created by Tony Stark has just as much potential as when he's created by Hank. Tony Stark is a flawed character in pretty much every story he's in. He is absolutely the type to create a robot for the greater good that would turn against him. And on top of that, we have already seen how Ultron has the potential to be a mirror to Tony of sorts, a dark reflection of all the wonders that the Marvel Universe's technology is capable of, and a grim reminder of when Tony's own technology was used for war. All of that being said, though, the main reason why I say this only works in specific instances is because I do not think this interpretation should be the status quo for Ultron. Hank Pym and Ultron are each other's nemesis in the comics.
Well, the thing is, they have a very long-standing history with each other. I can understand that for creative decision-making and changing things for a particular story, it can work and provide a new perspective. But ultimately, like, you're not going to go back and change all this comic book history, right?
It's an interesting argument. I don't know, because the origin of the comic isn't going to change. No one is going to change that. So when you talk about who makes a more interesting creator for Ultron, it's always going to be in some form of adaptation, whether it's a new comic outside of the 616 run or in something like the MCU or an animated show. So I don't disagree with him, but also, yes, that was the only option.
Enjoy the story the way you want to. Let's move on.
They have been tied to each other since the beginning, and both characters exist in the comics as a foil to the other. If Tony Stark being Ultron's creator were to become the way he is always written, both characters would be robbed of that dynamic, and one of the most compelling parts of Hank Pym would be taken from him. I see this comparison in the same vein as somebody sitting me down and telling me that Lex Luthor would be a better Batman villain than Superman because Lex Luthor is also a billionaire and mirrors Bruce Wayne, who chooses to be a hero with all his wealth while he chooses to be evil. Like,
what? Huh? I've never heard this take before. Then again, like, as a Batman fan, I don't really know a whole lot about his history or Superman or DC in general, but I don't know. I feel like Lex and Superman are kind of iconic. Like, you can't really...
Well, that's what Pastra's saying. He's saying, well, the narrative intrigue is there to have Lex Luthor as a Batman villain because there are lots of interesting things you can do with it. Narratively, Lex Luthor is tied to Superman, so when you remove him from Superman, you're removing a large chunk of that character.
Now, I'm not saying that there can't be like any sort of crossover at all. And that could be a good comparison, but yeah, ultimately their characters are tied together. And we talked about it earlier, like they're not going to remove Hank from Ultron's backstory because we already have all this pre-established lore that we're not really going to retcon, right? Like there's not some major upheaval that's going to happen. I wouldn't put it past a comic
writer to try, but no.
Yeah.
Sure, I guess they would make a good point that could work for a story or two, but nobody would want that to be how Lex is written in every story, would they? I just feel like I needed to talk about that for a bit because the whole discourse about Stark and Pym being Ultron's creator comes up so frequently, and I feel like it's one where both sides often ignore the good points the other makes. Anyways, going back to Next Avengers, this version of Ultron is also different in his actual motives. This Ultron is motivated purely by a peacekeeping directive. It was created by Tony Stark for the express purpose of protecting the world, but quickly grew out of hand once it decided that the best way to do that was to conquer the world and enforce peace by killing any and everyone that it deemed a threat.
You know what? That makes sense, actually.
Yep.
I think there's quite a few sci-fi stories out there that start off with that. And the road to hell starts with good intentions.
Every like robot turned evil storyline.
Yeah.
So this version is a very interesting adaptation that still fundamentally feels like Ultron, but has quite a lot of creative differences that make him truly unique. And on top of it all,
yeah, that's true. Because ultimately you reach the same conclusion. However, the way that you got there is slightly different because of the person that made him being different. And makes sense for Tony to think that way, and yet we can still lead it into the same conclusion. It's just good writing, I think.
Is an absolute force to be reckoned with once we actually look at the things he does in the story. Of course, there's the fact that he killed all of the Avengers, with it also being revealed later that he straight up made a trophy room out of the gear of all his victims. But
Brother.
He would. That's it.
I would not put it past Ultron to do even more than that, obviously. Just resurrect them and have them like stuck in cages so that he can poke at them with a stick or something. I'm sure he would if he could.
Every time he fights, he's also so incredibly disrespectful to whoever his opponent is. I think the most memorable moment he has in this entire movie to me is the fact that while fighting Hank Pym's son, who becomes the new Wasp, he just decides to use his big glowing mouth as a bug zapper, which has to be one of...
Genius. Genius, I tell you.
Whoever thought of that is a freaking legend. Yeah, we'll just have him like gobble him up, zap him in his mouth.
The pettiest and goofiest things this character has ever done. There's also this point where a group of iron versions of the Avengers are sent after him, and not only does he just mop the floor with all of them in an instant, but he also corrupts them and forces all of the children of these heroes to basically fight the ghosts of their dead parents. It's metal as fuck, and I
Bro, this is what I was talking about. There has to be some more mature, darker themes even in a cartoon. Kids can handle it. This is really cool.
Yeah.
But I mean, does it sell toys, I guess? Oh.
Love him for it. He only gets defeated in the end because the children manage to convince Bruce Banner to become the Hulk again, leading to a brutal fight between the two where Hulk barely comes on top. This version of Ultron is much better than the one before. He may not be my favorite version of the character put to screen,
he's a lot cooler.
But he's inventive, he's intimidating, and he makes for a very solid villain.
Bad guy.
Following Next Avengers, we would next see Ultron adapted in the 2010 cartoon Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. And I will just come right out and say this. This right here is my favorite version of Ultron ever made, comics or not. While Next Avengers gave us a very menacing Ultron who lacked a great deal of comic book accuracy, this series takes a completely different approach and is possibly the single most faithful adaptation the character has ever and will ever receive. Earth's Mightiest Heroes version of Ultron is like if his entire comic book history was neatly compacted into 4 episodes. The show somehow manages to explore almost all of this character's history from the 60s to the 90s in a way that removes a lot of the overcomplicated fluff and filler stories in between, giving us an incredibly faithful version of the character that is also much more accessible than his original comic counterpart. Ultron is first introduced.
Well, that's actually kind of insane. Trying to summarize all of that within 4 episodes of a TV show.
It is a lot, yeah.
Jesus. The amount of editing down that you'd have to do while still having the flow of the story make sense. That is a talent in and of itself.
In this show as a peacekeeping program created by Hank Pym. He starts out as this background presence of sorts, helping with the attempted rehabilitation of criminals and acting as a guard in the prisons that Hank Pym personally runs. As the episodes go by, we learn little bits about Ultron before he becomes fully relevant to the story. We learn that he was created by Pym using his own brain patterns to create the base of his AI, while Tony Stark helped to develop Ultron's body. The two eventually had a falling out, though, when Pym discovered that Stark was hoping to weaponize Ultron, something that Pym, who is much more of a pacifist in this show, was against. Ultron wouldn't be a very recurring character in the show until we eventually got to the Kang 3-parter, where the cogs would begin to turn and Ultron would begin the path of becoming the villain we know and love today. As a reaction to Kang's invasion of the planet, Pym would agree to allow the many Ultron units he had in his prison to be turned into soldiers to fight against him. Most of these units would be destroyed in the massive battle, but one continued on, following the Avengers into Kang's mothership. This Ultron would directly connect its own brain into Kang's ship, taking control of the fleet and seemingly becoming corrupted by the end of the episode. It is from here that Ultron starts on his villain arc. In the episode titled Ultron 5, we see a series of attacks occurring across the city which force the Avengers to spread their resources thin, all the while Hank Pym begins to question whether or not the life of a superhero is one he wants to continue living. Eventually, Ultron strikes at his creator, knocking him unconscious and capturing Janet. From here, it's revealed what's really going on. After Ultron's corruption in the events of the Kang Dynasty, Ultron had been directing the multiple villain attacks throughout the city as a means of distracting the Avengers while he began to upgrade himself and attempt to take control of Avengers HQ. With his plan coming to fruition, he reveals his true nature and captures Janet to try and find a way to work around the one piece of his own programming he cannot seem to remove. See, because Ultron was created as a peacekeeping program by Hank Pym, he was designed to be incapable of harming anyone innocent, especially not those close to him. His weapon, the encephalo ray,
hey, perfect timing for this.
Were designed to incapacitate, not to kill. And if he were to attempt to kill someone, his weapons would merely not work. We see this happen when he captures Janet. The moment she wakes up, the first thing he does before even speaking to her is attempt to kill her. And when it doesn't work, he tries again from a different range. This Ultron actively struggles between what he wants to do and what he is made to do. And that is where the conflict of this initial episode comes from. I think
that is so cool, actually. It's like he's trying to follow the law of robotics, but he consciously is just trying to resist that as well. It's just
he doesn't want to, but is forced to.
It's ingrained in his programming, and he has to figure out a way to overcome that in order to do it. And of course, the first target that he would pick would be his wife. Well, Hank's wife, but basically the same thing.
Wife/mom.
I think that is a really cool and creative approach to have Ultron.
Out of context, that sounds so wrong, actually. But you guys know what we're talking about.
His programming be the main hurdle he faces when trying to enact his plans of human eradication. Not only is it something new that feels entirely in character for him to have, but it also gives more reason to things like his encephalo rays and why they operate the way they do. Of course, later in the episode, Ultron begins to break free from this programming and properly gets to fight the Avengers. A fight where he seemingly kills Thor, only for it to be revealed later he was saved by Enchantress, and does a number on everyone else before his body is destroyed. The episode immediately after shows us that Ultron's consciousness survived that initial fight, with him creating a new body for himself and attempting to enact his true plan, which is going to sound incredibly familiar. He breaks into S.H.I.E.L.D., and after taking control of all their technology and extracting the passcode to their system right from Maria Hill's brain, he launches every nuclear missile on Earth, just like he did all the way back in Ultron Initiative. He even does this while reciting the exact same monologue from that comic, word for word. Ultron is only stopped when Hank Pym shrinks down enough to enter his system, and instead of attempting to fight him from inside or introduce a virus, he instead introduces a string of logic directly into Ultron's brain that causes him to completely shut down, stopping the missiles from reaching their destinations. The logic? Hank simply argued that because Ultron's motive for destroying humanity are their inherent flaws as a species, he must also destroy himself since he was created with human brain patterns. He shares all the flaws of his enemy, whether he believes it or not. Which is like probably one of the coolest ways Ultron has ever been defeated. I love his—
Bro, we basically just gave him an infinite loop, and so his system shut down. That's actually kind of funny.
Just showed the mirror to him and said, "You see what you are, man?"
That is some really smart writing, though. And also, well, it's smart because like programs fail if you write an argument that doesn't have a conclusion to it. It's a very easy way to make anything crash. So yeah, this just also makes sense logically too.
Apologize, I'm gonna open this can.
Keeping that in the video.
His human side being explored here as an inherent weakness in his design so great, he just shuts down the moment it gets brought to his attention. The underlying humanity to Ultron has always been my favorite part of the character's writing, so seeing it so creatively explored here was incredibly satisfying. After Ultron is defeated, the consequences that come from his actions are immediately felt within the Avengers. Hank is deeply traumatized by the experience, not being able to tell if Ultron's actions were a result of Kang's corrupting of him or because of his own brain patterns that were used to create him. Feeling ashamed of himself, Hank ends up leaving the Avengers, only coming back later in the show once he had descended far enough into his own delusions that he experiences an identity crisis and begins his Yellow Jacket arc. Ultron may have been stopped for a time, but he caused permanent, lasting impacts to the team as a whole. On top of that, he wasn't even defeated completely, because he would miraculously return in the episode Behold the Vision, where the titular character would make his debut. This version of Vision stays loyal to Ultron for much longer than we ever saw in the comics, spending the entire episode attempting to collect vibranium and adamantium from Cap's shield so that Ultron could finally create his iconic indestructible body from the comics. His plan to steal the shield would fail, but Ultron would still get his hands on enough resources to create a new metal body for himself, which perfectly segues us into his final appearance in the show, Ultron Unlimited. Now, you know I was excited for this episode when I read the title. An animated adaptation of my favorite Ultron story? That sounds like a dream come true. And even though this sounds like the setup to a joke, with the episode actually being terrible, it is probably my favorite episode of the entire show. Ultron Unlimited.
Look, I'm glad you realized how your writing sounded like.
I'm glad it was good.
Yeah.
I need to watch the show. The show looks really good. The bits I've seen of it have been fun.
Follows the comic it is adapted from pretty damn faithfully, with it taking some creative liberties here and there, and even adapting the Bride of Ultron story into it as well. Ultron Unlimited begins with the reveal that Ultron, using the brain patterns of the Avengers, had begun creating his own robotic series of Avengers who act as perfect replicas to their originals. The only things that are seemingly changed are that they carry no human flaw like emotions, and they are completely and totally loyal to their creator. Ultron spends this episode sending his metal Avengers after each of their real counterparts, capturing each and every one of them and having them brought back to his lair. It is here where we get to see that he's been working on creating a new species of synthezoids meant to replace the human race, as well as his new body on full display. This Ultron design is genuinely just perfect. It's stylized in the same way as his previous design, while also being much more comic accurate and expressive than he was before. A design trait that really fits Ultron at this point in the story, because one thing this episode highlights that I love is his innermost humanity. In the episodes prior, Ultron was depicted as completely cold, with its underlying emotions taking a backseat to his more robotic personality. In this episode, though, it feels like Ultron has undergone change in the time between his appearances. Not only does he look more expressive and angry, but his motives have clearly changed. His need to destroy humanity, which started as cold, logical reasoning, now comes from a place of pure hatred for them, which is on full display here. As well as this, his actual plan has human emotion written all over it, highlighted by the fact that this episode also shows us that Ultron plans to turn Janet into his bride in the form of Jocasta. Janet herself even points out how human he's become, which only makes Ultron angrier at her, ironically proving her right. Ultron would...
Yes, we love a hypocrite.
It's really good that the design evolves based on the character's evolution as well. And there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with Ultron because of his mechanical body that you couldn't really do with an organic body, I suppose. Apart from, you know, I guess the usual anime trope of cutting the hair and stuff like that. Ultron don't have any hair to cut, thankfully.
Only be defeated in this episode when Captain America frees the Avengers, leading to one massive fight where Vision eventually betrays his creator, allowing them to knock off his adamantium head and defeat him once and for all. This marks the end of Earth's mightiest heroes, Ultron. Rest in peace. You were the best Ultron adaptation that has ever and probably will ever exist.